Little girl walks out of janitor's closet. Teacher sees her knees and calls 911 in shock. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The first golden rays of morning light filtered through the classroom windows of Maple Creek Elementary, casting warm patterns across empty desks. Mrs. Eleanor Delaney moved between the rows, preparing for another day of teaching her first-grade class. 23 years in the classroom had given her an intuition about her students. Which ones needed extra encouragement, which ones thrived with independence, and which ones carried burdens too heavy for their small shoulders. As the clock ticked toward 7:30 a.m., the classroom door creaked open. Mrs. Delaney looked up to see a tiny figure slip inside. Maisie Parker, her golden hair pulled back in an uneven ponytail, clutching a well-worn teddy bear against her chest. "Good morning, Maisie," Mrs. Delaney said warmly. "You're early again today." Maisie nodded silently, her blue eyes serious in her pale face. She made her way to her desk in the back corner, moving carefully as though trying not to be noticed. The teddy bear, Button was his name, never left her side. It was the third time that week Maisie had arrived before anyone else, including the crossing guards. Mrs. Delaney watched as the little girl took out her notebook and a stubby pencil, then carefully tucked Button into the desk beside her. "Would you like to help me put up these number charts?" Mrs. Delaney asked. Maisie nodded, sliding from her chair. As she reached for the colorful paper Mrs. Delaney held out, her sweater sleeve rode up, revealing thin wrists. The sweater itself was too small, the cuffs barely reaching her wrists, despite the winter chill outside. Together they worked in comfortable silence, Maisie handing Mrs. Delaney pushpins with solemn concentration. It wasn't until the little girl stood on tiptoe to point at a crooked corner that Mrs. Delaney noticed her shoes, scuffed, worn through at the toes and at least a size too small. "Thank you for your help, Maisie," Mrs. Delaney said when they finished. "You have a good eye for detail." The faintest smile ghosted across Maisie's face before disappearing like a snowflake on warm skin. Other children began arriving, filling the classroom with chatter and movement. Maisie retreated to her desk, becoming almost invisible as the room grew louder. Throughout the morning, Mrs. Delaney noticed how the little girl's eyes followed her movements, how she listened with unusual intensity during story time, and how she savored every bite of her free school breakfast as if memorizing the taste. At recess, while other children raced outside, Maisie asked in her whisper-soft voice if she could stay in to help organize books. Mrs. Delaney agreed, watching as the girl methodically arranged picture books by color, her teddy bear propped against the bookshelf. "Button likes the library," Maisie said unexpectedly, stroking the bear's threadbare ear. "Does he?" Mrs. Delaney responded, delighted at this rare voluntary communication. "What else does Button like?" "Warm places," Maisie said, "and quiet. He doesn't like loud noises or cold. Something in the way." She said it made Mrs. Delaney's teacher instincts sharpen with concern. As the day continued, she kept a closer eye on Maisie, noticing how the girl winced when sitting, how she kept her sweater on despite the warm classroom, how her lunchbox contained only a single granola bar. When dismissal came, Maisie was in no hurry to leave. She packed her backpack with deliberate slowness, tucked Button carefully inside, and finally slipped under her desk to tie her shoes. It was then that Mrs. Delaney saw it, Maisie removing her worn shoes completely, hiding them under the desk, and instead, pulling out a pair of even more damaged shoes from her backpack. Their eyes met, and in that moment a silent understanding passed between them. Maisie quickly looked away, her small hands trembling slightly as she tied the second pair of shoes. "See you tomorrow, Mrs. Delaney," she whispered, hurrying toward the door. "Maisie," Mrs. Delaney called softly, "is everything all right at home?" The little girl paused, clutching Button tighter. "Great Aunt Ruth tries really hard," she said finally, and then she was gone, leaving Mrs. Delaney standing alone in the classroom with a growing sense that something was very wrong in Maisie Parker's world. The small yellow house at the end of Willow Lane had seen better days. Paint peeled from the shutters, the front steps sagged slightly, and the garden that once bloomed with roses now lay dormant under scattered leaves. Inside, 80-year-old. Ruth Parker moved slowly through her morning routine, the kettle whistling insistently on the stove. "Coming, coming," she murmured, though no one was there to hear. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she poured hot water into a teacup, missing slightly and creating a small puddle on the counter. She didn't notice. Ruth's gaze drifted to the clock on the wall. 8:15 a.m. A faint alarm bell rang in her mind, something important about the time. But the thought slipped away like mist through her fingers. Instead, she shuffled to the living room where old photographs lined the mantel, dusty windows into happier times. She picked up a framed photo of a young couple holding a baby, her niece Emily, Emily's husband John, and baby Maisie, their faces bright with hope. Ruth's fingers traced the glass gently. "Such a tragedy," she whispered. The car accident 3 years ago had changed everything. Now it was just Ruth and little Maisie trying their best to carry on. Ruth loved Maisie with all her heart. The little girl was her last connection to family, a precious reminder of Emily. But caring for a 6-year-old required energy that Ruth's aging body increasingly couldn't provide. The Social Security checks barely covered their basic needs, and Ruth's arthritis made even simple tasks challenging. She put the photo down and noticed another. Maisie on her first day of school last year, golden hair and pigtails, holding Button, the teddy bear that had been her constant companion since the accident. School. The thought suddenly connected in Ruth's mind. "Maisie's lunch!" she exclaimed, hurrying back to the kitchen. But when she opened the refrigerator, she found mostly empty shelves. There was no bread for sandwiches, just half a box of granola bars on the counter. Ruth took one and placed it in Maisie's lunchbox, making a mental note to go shopping later. She'd been forgetting things more often lately, appointments, bills, even meals sometimes. The doctor had mentioned some tests, used words like early cognitive decline, but Ruth had been too proud to follow up. She could manage. She had to, for Maisie's sake. Ruth glanced at the thermostat set at 60 degrees to save on heating bills. The house felt chilly, but they could manage with extra sweaters until the next check arrived. She sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly tired. Had Maisie already left for school? Ruth couldn't remember their morning routine. Had she helped the child get dressed? Had she made her breakfast? The days blended together lately, and gaps appeared in her memory without warning. The kitchen clock now showed 2:30 p.m. Ruth blinked in confusion. How had the morning passed so quickly? She'd meant to tidy up, to prepare something warm for Maisie's return from school. School. The thought triggered another realization. "Pickup time," she murmured, rising shakily. On Wednesdays, she was supposed to meet Maisie at the school gate. Or was today Thursday? Ruth searched for a calendar but found none. She pulled on her coat and fumbled for her keys, anxiety rising as she realized she might be late. The old station wagon in the driveway had just enough gas to get to the school and back. She'd have to remember to fill it when the next check came. As Ruth backed out of the driveway, her mind drifted again to Emily and John. "I'm doing my best," she whispered, as if they could hear her. "I promise I'm trying." At Maple Creek Elementary, the schoolyard had emptied of children. As Ruth parked and made her way slowly to the front entrance, the winter sun was already beginning its early descent, shadows lengthening across the pavement. Inside, she found the hallways quiet except for the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner. Had she come on the wrong day? Ruth's confusion deepened as she checked her watch. 3:45 p.m. She was very late. "Can I help you?" asked a janitor who was mopping nearby. "I'm looking for Maisie Parker," Ruth explained, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm her great-aunt." The janitor's expression softened with recognition. "Mrs. Delaney was looking for you earlier. I think they're still in classroom 103 down that hallway." As Ruth made her way toward the classroom, her heart heavy with guilt, she didn't see the concerned glances that followed her. She only knew that once again, Despite her best intentions, she had failed Maisie. The school had grown quiet as evening approached. Most of the classrooms stood dark and empty, the children long gone to the warmth of their homes. In room 103, Mrs. Delaney sat alone at her desk, a stack of spelling tests before her, though her mind wasn't on the papers. All afternoon, she'd helped Maisie wait for Great Aunt Ruth. They'd colored pictures, read books, and arranged our flashcards, anything to keep the little girl's mind off the ticking clock. When Ruth finally arrived, nearly 2 hours late and clearly disoriented, Mrs. Delaney had watched the fragile reunion with growing concern. "I got the days mixed up," Ruth had explained, her weathered hands trembling. "I'm so sorry, Maisie girl." Maisie had simply nodded, her small face revealing nothing as she carefully packed Button into her backpack. "It's okay, Aunt Ruth. I know you forget sometimes." That exchange had haunted Mrs. Delaney all evening. She'd seen the worn-through shoes, the too small clothes, the meager lunches. Now the late pickups and Ruth's confusion added to a picture that made her heart ache. With a sigh, Mrs. Delaney gathered her things. It was nearly 7 p.m. She'd stayed far too late again. Her husband would be wondering where she was. As she locked her classroom door, a faint sound caught her attention. Something between a whimper and a sigh coming from down the hallway. Mrs. Delaney paused, listening. There it was again, barely audible. Following the sound, she found herself at the door of the school's storage room, a large closet filled with extra supplies, seasonal decorations, and teaching materials. The door was slightly ajar, though it should have been locked. "Hello?" she called softly, pushing the door open wider. "Is someone in here?" The storage room was dark except for a thin shaft of hallway light that illuminated shelves of paper supplies and craft materials. At first, Mrs. Delaney saw nothing unusual. Then movement caught her eye, a small shadow shifting behind a stack of cardboard boxes in the far corner. Mrs. Delaney's hand found the light switch. As fluorescent lights flickered to life, her breath caught in her throat. There, curled in a nest of construction paper and old bulletin board decorations, lay Maisie. Her golden hair was tangled around her face, her small body curved protectively around Button. Her knees were badly bruised, likely from a fall, and her socks had holes in them. No shoes in sight. "Maisie?" Mrs. Delaney whispered, kneeling beside the child. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" The little girl startled awake, her blue eyes wide with fear before focusing on her teacher's face. Relief and shame washed over her features in equal measure. "I'm sorry," she whispered, clutching Button tighter. "I didn't mean to be bad." "You're not bad," Mrs. Delaney assured her, noticing how the child shivered despite the building's heat. "But I need to know why you're here, honey. Did Aunt Ruth bring you back to school?" Maisie shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "She fell asleep after dinner. I couldn't wake her up, and the house was so cold." Her voice dropped even lower. "I walked back here because I remembered you have that special heater in our classroom." Mrs. Delaney felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Maisie had walked back to school, alone, in the winter evening, seeking warmth. "How did you get in, sweetheart?" "The janitor knows me," Maisie explained. "He was locking up and saw me. I told him I forgot Button and he let me look, but then he had to go to the basement." Her small shoulders hunched. "I was going to leave, but it was so warm in here." "Hazike." Mrs. Delaney helped the exhausted child sit up. Maisie looked at her with eyes too wise for a 6-year-old. "It was warmer in here than at home," she whispered. The simple statement hung in the air between them, more devastating than any cry or complaint could have been. Mrs. Delaney felt something break inside her chest as she gathered the little girl into her arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile. "You're safe now," she promised, her teacher's mind already calculating next steps while her heart thundered with protective instinct. "You're safe with me." But as Maisie's small arms wrapped around her neck, Mrs. Delaney knew that this moment of safety was temporary. Tomorrow, Maisie would return to a cold house and an elderly guardian who, despite her love, couldn't provide the care a young child needed. unless someone intervened. The pediatric wing of Riverside Community Hospital was painted in cheerful colors, ocean blue walls adorned with whimsical sea creatures, designed to make children feel less frightened. But as Mrs. Delaney sat in the vinyl visitor's chair beside Maisie's bed, she could see that the cheerful surroundings did little to ease the little girl's anxiety. Maisie lay quietly beneath the hospital blankets, button clutched against her chest, her blue eyes following every movement of the nurses and doctors who came to check on her. She hadn't cried when the nurse had taken her temperature or when the doctor had examined her bruised knees. She hadn't complained when they'd drawn blood or listened to her lungs. She had simply watched everything with solemn acceptance, as though medical procedures were just another part of life to be endured. That quiet stoicism broke Mrs. Delaney's heart more than tears would have. The night before had been a blur of activity. After finding Maisie in the storage room, Mrs. Delaney had called 911, then Ruth Parker. The paramedics had arrived first, gently wrapping Maisie in a blanket and checking her vital signs. They'd spoken in low, concerned voices about her temperature, her thin appearance, the bruising on her knees. When Ruth had finally arrived, driven by a neighbor, her confusion and distress had been evident. "I thought she was sleeping," she'd repeated, her weathered face creased with anguish. "I checked on her before I laid down for my nap. At least, I thought I did." Now, nearly 24 hours later, the initial tests had confirmed what the doctors suspected. Maisie was underweight, showing signs of malnutrition, and the beginning stages of a respiratory infection lurked in her lungs. "Mrs. Delaney," Maisie's whisper drew the teacher from her thoughts. "Is Aunt Ruth in trouble?" The question, delivered with such genuine concern, made Mrs. Delaney's eyes sting with tears. "No, sweetheart," she assured the child, smoothing a strand of golden hair from Maisie's forehead. "Your aunt isn't in trouble. The doctors just want to make sure she's okay too. Sometimes older people need checkups just like children do." This was partly true. Ruth Parker was currently being evaluated in the geriatric wing of the same hospital. Mrs. Delaney had overheard enough from the social worker to know that Ruth's cognitive assessment wasn't going well. "Will I go home soon?" Maisie asked, her fingers nervously stroking Button's worn ear. Mrs. Delaney chose her words carefully. "The doctors want you to stay here for a little while until you're feeling stronger. You have a bit of a cold starting and they want to make sure it doesn't get worse." Maisie nodded as though this made perfect sense. "The hospital is very warm," she observed quietly, "and the bed is soft." The simple gratitude for these basic comforts tightened Mrs. Delaney's throat. Before she could respond, a gentle knock sounded at the door. A woman in a neat blue suit entered, her kind face wreathed in a professional smile. "Hello, Maisie. I'm Ms. Jackson from Child Protective Services. I'd like to talk with you for a little while, if that's okay." Mrs. Delaney felt Maisie's small hand slip into hers, squeezing tightly. "It's all right," Mrs. Delaney assured her. "Ms. Jackson just wants to ask you some questions about home. Would you like me to stay with you while you talk?" Maisie nodded, her eyes never leaving the social worker. Ms. Jackson pulled up a chair. "That teddy bear looks like he's been loved a lot," she began gently. "What's his name?" "Button," Maisie whispered. "He was my mom's when she was little." "That's special," Ms. Jackson smiled. "Can you tell me about a typical day at home with your Aunt Ruth?" As Maisie hesitantly began describing her daily routine, waking up early to dress herself, often eating cereal dry because the milk had run out, walking to school alone, because Ruth had trouble with morning coordination, Mrs. Delaney watched Ms. Jackson's face. The social worker maintained her warm expression, but her eyes reflected growing concern. "And what about dinner time?" Ms. Jackson asked. "Sometimes Aunt Ruth makes soup," Maisie explained. "But sometimes she forgets or she falls asleep. Then I have crackers or cereal." A hint of pride entered her voice. "I can make toast all by myself." Mrs. Delaney blinked back tears, imagining this tiny girl standing on tiptoe to reach a toaster, feeding herself while her elderly guardian slept. Later in the Hallway outside Maisie's room. Ms. Jackson spoke quietly to Mrs. Delaney. "This is a clear case of unintentional neglect," she explained. "Ruth Parker loves her great-niece, but she simply isn't capable of providing adequate care. We're working on finding appropriate placements for both of them." "Both?" Mrs. Delaney asked. "Ruth will likely need assisted living. And Maisie—" Ms. Jackson hesitated. "Well, we're looking at temporary foster placement options." As if sensing they were talking about her, Maisie appeared in the doorway of her room, button clutched to her chest, her hospital gown, too large for her small frame. "Mrs. Delaney?" she called softly. "Could you read me a story?" The nurse brought some books. Something shifted in Mrs. Delaney's heart as she looked at the little girl. A child who asked for so little and faced uncertainty with such quiet courage. "Of course. Sweetheart," she said, following Maisie back into the room. "I'd be happy to." The geriatric wing of Riverside Community Hospital couldn't have been more different from the pediatric floor. Instead of colorful sea creatures, the walls were painted a gentle sage green. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, and the nurses moved with unhurried efficiency among their elderly patients. Ruth Parker sat on the edge of her hospital bed, her thin hands folded in her lap, staring at the calendar on the wall. November 2023. The date meant something important, but the significance danced just beyond her grasp. "Mrs. Parker?" A young doctor with kind eyes entered, carrying a clipboard. "I'm Dr. Chen. How are you feeling this morning?" Ruth straightened her cardigan, aware of its frayed edges. "I'm quite well, thank you, though I don't understand why I need to be here. I should be getting home to Maisie." Dr. Chen pulled up a chair. "Maisie is being well cared for on another floor. Do you remember what happened yesterday?" Ruth's forehead creased with concentration. Yesterday. There had been confusion, worried faces, an ambulance. Maisie had been missing from her bed, but the details swirled like autumn leaves, impossible to gather. "Not entirely," she admitted. "That's okay," Dr. Chen assured her. "Mrs. Parker, we've completed some initial cognitive assessments. I'd like to discuss the results with you." Ruth's fingers twisted anxiously in her lap. "Is this about my forgetfulness? My regular doctor mentioned something. Tests I should have done." She looked up with sudden clarity. "But the insurance forms were confusing, and then Maisie needed new shoes, and somehow I never got back to it." Dr. Chen nodded understandingly. "You're showing signs of what we call mild to moderate cognitive impairment. This affects your memory, decision-making, and sometimes your awareness of time." "I've always been a bit absent-minded," Ruth protested, though deep down, she knew this was different. The gaps in her memory had been growing, days disappearing without trace, familiar tasks becoming puzzles. "This is more than absent-mindedness," Dr. Chen explained gently, "and it's affecting your ability to care for yourself and for Maisie." At the mention of her great-niece, Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "She's all I have left of Emily," she whispered. "My niece, I was like a daughter to me. When she and John died," her voice broke, "I promised I'd take care of their little girl." Dr. Chen placed a comforting hand on Ruth's shoulder. "Your love for Maisie is very clear, but loving someone sometimes means recognizing when they need more than we can give." Social worker named Mr. Patel joined them, explaining options for assisted living facilities where Ruth could receive the support she needed. As he spoke, Ruth's attention drifted to the window, where autumn leaves spiraled from a maple tree. Emily had loved autumn. Ruth could almost see her niece. As a child, jumping into piles of crunchy leaves, laughing. Now Emily was gone, and her daughter needed someone stronger than Ruth had turned out to be. "Could I see Maisie?" Ruth asked suddenly, interrupting Mr. Patel's explanation of Medicare coverage. "I need to tell her I'm sorry." "The social worker exchanged glances with Dr. Chen. "Of course," Mr. Patel said kindly. "We can arrange a visit later today." When they left, Ruth remained sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the darkened television screen. She hardly recognized the frail woman looking back at her when Had she gotten so old? Inside, she still felt like the capable woman who had taught elementary school for 40 years, who had traveled during summers, who had helped raise her beloved niece. A nurse brought lunch, but Ruth couldn't eat. Her thoughts kept returning to the little yellow house on Willow Lane, to Maisie's small face pinched with cold, to the empty refrigerator she'd meant to fill. "Mrs. Parker?" A familiar voice drew her attention. Eleanor Delaney stood in the doorway, her expression gentle with compassion. "Maisie's teacher," Ruth said, relief washing over her. Here was someone who knew Maisie, who could tell her how the child was doing. "Is she all right? My great niece?" Mrs. Delaney sat beside Ruth. "Maisie is doing better. The doctors are taking good care of her." "She's such a good girl," Ruth said, her voice breaking. "So quiet, never complains. Even when I forget things, she just adapts. She shouldn't have to do that. Children should be children." "Yes, they should," Mrs. Delaney agreed softly. Ruth reached out, grasping the teacher's hand with surprising strength. "I love her so much, but I'm failing her. I can feel my mind slipping away some days, like sand through my fingers." Tears spilled down her wrinkled cheeks. "What's going to happen to her?" Mrs. Delaney hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "The social workers are looking for a safe place where Maisie can be properly cared for." "Foster care," Ruth whispered, the words falling like stones. "She'll be with strangers. They'll find good people," Mrs. Delaney assured her, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Ruth drew a shaky breath, straightening her shoulders with the last of her dignity. "When you see her, please tell Maisie that I love her, that I tried my best, and that none of it, is her fault." As Mrs. Delaney promised she would deliver the message, neither woman noticed Maisie herself standing just outside the open door, button clutched to her chest, her small face solemn as she absorbed every word about her uncertain future. The fluorescent lights of the hospital conference room cast harsh shadows across the faces gathered around the oval table. Ms. Jackson from Child Protective Services flipped through a thick folder, her expression growing more troubled with each page. "The situation is clear-cut, but the solution isn't," she explained to the small group assembled for Maisie's case conference. "Ruth Parker can no longer provide adequate care, but our options for Maisie are limited." Mrs. Delaney sat quietly at the table, officially present as Maisie's teacher to provide insight into her school behavior. Unofficially, she had barely left the hospital in the 3 days since finding Maisie in the storage room. Something about the little girl's quiet resilience had wrapped around her heart, refusing to let go. "What exactly are the options?" asked Dr. Brennan, the pediatrician overseeing Maisie's care. Ms. Jackson sighed, pushing her glasses up her nose. "That's the problem. We have a serious shortage of foster placements right now. The emergency shelters are at capacity, and the few available foster homes are already taking multiple children. She can't just stay in the hospital indefinitely," Dr. Brennan and I pointed out. "Of course not. We're looking at temporary placement in a group home until a suitable foster family becomes available. The closest opening is at Oakwood Children's Center." Mrs. Delaney's stomach tightened at the mention of Oakwood. Though not a bad facility, it was institutional, a place where children's basic needs were met but little attention could be given to their emotional well-being. The thought of Maisie there, clutching button, trying to make herself invisible in a crowd of older children, made her heart ache. "How long would she stay there?" Mrs. Delaney asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Ms. Jackson spread her hands helplessly. "That's impossible to predict. Foster placements for 6-year-old girls usually come up within a few months, but it could be longer." "And Ruth?" Dr. Brennan asked. "Social services for the elderly is handling her case. She'll likely be placed in an assisted living facility. The cognitive decline is significant enough that independent living isn't recommended, but she doesn't require full nursing care yet." The meeting continued, voices washing over Mrs. Delaney as she stared at the institutional beige wall. All she could. Z was Maisie's face when she'd found her in the storage closet. It was warmer in there than at home. Later that evening, Mrs. Delaney sat beside Maisie's hospital bed, reading The Velveteen Rabbit aloud. The little girl lay quietly, button tucked under her chin, her blue eyes never leaving. Mrs. Delaney's face. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day. Mrs. Delaney read, her voice gentle in the hushed room. "Mrs. Delaney?" Maisie interrupted softly. "Is Aunt Ruth very sick?" The teacher carefully closed the book. "Your aunt's mind is having some trouble remembering things. The doctors are helping her just like they're helping you." Maisie nodded solemnly. "I know she forgets a lot. Sometimes she calls me Emily." "Emily was your mother, wasn't she?" "Uh-huh. Aunt Ruth has a picture of her on the fireplace." Maisie's small fingers twisted in the hospital blanket. "Mrs. Delaney, where will I go when the hospital makes me better?" The question, delivered with such matter-of-fact acceptance, made Mrs. Delaney's chest tighten. "The social workers are finding a good place for you to stay while your aunt gets better." "Will I still go to our school?" "I don't know." "Sweetheart." Maisie absorbed this with the same quiet stoicism she showed toward everything. "Could Button stay with you until I know where I'm going, so he doesn't get lost?" The simple request, this child trying to protect her most precious possession in a world where everything else was uncertain, was almost Mrs. Delaney's undoing. "Button should stay with you," she managed, swallowing the lump in her throat. "He helps you be brave." After Maisie finally drifted to sleep, Mrs. Delaney walked the hospital corridors, unable to leave yet too restless to sit. She found herself standing outside the empty school storage room where she'd discovered Maisie. The janitor had left the light on, and she could still see the outline where the little girl had curled up seeking warmth. That night, Mrs. Delaney couldn't sleep. She lay awake beside her husband, staring at the ceiling as images of Maisie cycled through her mind. Maisie hiding her worn shoes, Maisie making herself toast because Ruth had forgotten dinner, Maisie waiting hours after school for someone to come, Maisie in a group home, lost among dozens of other children, no one to notice if she ate or if she smiled or if she needed new shoes. The clock ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2. At 3, Mrs. Delaney finally slipped from bed and went to the spare room, the one they'd decorated years ago, hoping for children who had never come. She stood in the doorway, imagining a small bed where the exercise equipment now stood, colorful books on the empty shelves, a little girl with golden hair and solemn blue eyes finding safety there. By morning, the shadows under Mrs. Delaney's eyes told the story of her sleepless night. But something had settled in her heart, a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. The teacher's lounge at Maple Creek Elementary was unusually crowded for a Tuesday morning. Word had spread quickly about Maisie Parker and the circumstances that had led to her hospitalization. Now, as Mrs. Delaney stood before her colleagues, their faces reflected concern, shock, and compassion. "I've known something wasn't right," said Ms. Winters, the art teacher. "She always draws the same picture, a small yellow house with no people in it. When I asked about her family, she just added her teddy bear to the drawing. She never joins the other children at recess," added Mr. Thompson, who supervised the playground. "She sits on the bench reading or just watching. I thought she was shy." Principal Garcia, a woman whose stern exterior concealed a deeply compassionate heart, spoke up from where she stood by the coffee maker. "The question now is what we can do for Maisie. Eleanor, you've been at the hospital. What's the current situation?" Mrs. Delaney looked around at the concerned faces of her colleagues. She hadn't slept properly in days, and the fatigue showed in the shadows beneath her eyes. But there was also a new determination in her expression, a focus that hadn't been there before. "Social services is struggling to find an appropriate placement," she explained. "There's a severe shortage of foster homes right now. The most likely scenario is that Maisie will be sent to Oakwood Children's Center until a foster family becomes available." A murmur of dismay rippled through the room. Everyone knew Oakwood, an institutional setting where children's basic needs were met, but individual attention was scarce. "That's not right," said Mrs. Patel, the school librarian. "Maisie needs stability and nurturing, not an institution. She's already lost so much." "I agree," Mrs. Delaney said quietly. "That's why I've decided to apply to become her foster parent." The room fell silent. Principal Garcia was the first to respond, her eyebrows rising in surprise. "Eleanor, that's a significant commitment. Are you sure about this?" "I've been thinking about it constantly," Mrs. Delaney admitted. "Robert and I discussed it all weekend. We always wanted children, but it never happened for us." She took a deep breath. Finding Maisie in that storage closet, seeing how she's tried to adapt to impossible circumstances without complaint, it changed something in me. I can't explain it, but I know we're meant to help her. A moment of silence followed before the school counselor, Dr. Morris, spoke up. "The approval process for foster parenting isn't quick or easy. There are home inspections, background checks, training requirements." "I know," Mrs. Delaney nodded. "I've already started the paperwork, but Maisie will likely be moved to Oakwood while all that is happening, and she'll lose her connection to our school, to the one stable place in her life." Principal Garcia set down her coffee cup with a decisive click. "Then we need to make a case for keeping her in this district regardless of temporary placement. I can speak directly with the superintendent. A district exception could be arranged. And we can all write letters of support for your foster application," added Ms. Winters. "Character references from an entire school faculty might carry some weight." The meeting transformed into an impromptu planning session. Teachers volunteered to collect clothes, books, and supplies for Maisie. The school nurse offered to coordinate with the hospital about Maisie's medical needs. The cafeteria manager promised to ensure Maisie would have extra food available whenever she needed it. As the first bell rang and teachers began gathering their materials to return to classrooms, Mrs. Patel approached Mrs. Delaney privately. "I saw you standing outside that storage closet yesterday afternoon," she said gently. "You looked haunted." Mrs. Delaney sighed. "I keep seeing her there, Patricia. Every time I close my eyes, I see her curled up trying to stay warm, all alone." "That image is changing you," Mrs. Patel observed. "It is," Mrs. Delaney agreed. "Last night I had a dream. Maisie was calling for help from behind a door that was slowly closing. I couldn't reach her in time." Her voice broke slightly. "I woke up in tears and I knew I couldn't let that door close on her future." Mrs. Patel squeezed her colleague's arm. "Then we'll all help keep that door open." That afternoon, after her students had been dismissed, Mrs. Delaney found a stack of envelopes on her desk, letters of support from every teacher and staff member at Maple Creek Elementary. On top was a note from Principal Garcia. "I've called in some favors with the district. Use these letters for your application. I've also contacted a friend at Social Services. Go make a difference for Maisie." Mrs. Delaney gathered the letters with trembling hands, hope and determination warring with the fear of bureaucratic roadblocks and delays. As she drove to the hospital for her daily visit with Maisie, the weight of what she was undertaking settled over her, the immense responsibility of caring for a child who had already experienced so much loss. But when she walked into Maisie's hospital room and saw the little girl's face light up at the sight of her, Mrs. Delaney knew with absolute certainty that she was making the right choice, no matter how difficult the path ahead might be. The hospital playroom was painted in cheerful yellows and blues, with child-sized furniture scattered throughout, and shelves lined with toys and books. Maisie sat at a small table by the window, carefully coloring a picture while Mrs. Delaney watched from a nearby chair. After nearly a week in the hospital, some color had returned to Maisie's cheeks. The regular meals and warm environment had already made a visible difference. Her golden hair, freshly washed and brushed, caught the afternoon sunlight as she bent over her drawing. "What are you creating today?" Mrs. Delaney asked, pleased to see the child engaged in an activity she enjoyed. Maisie looked up, still shy but more willing to speak than she had been days before. "It's Button's story," she explained softly, pointing to different parts of her drawing. See, this is when. My mom got him when she was little, and this is when she gave him to me, and this is Button now. Mrs. Delaney moved closer to examine the picture. Button has had quite a journey. He's very special to have been loved by both you and your mother. Aunt Ruth says he's a family heirloom. Maisie, pronounce the big word carefully. That means he's important to keep. Your Aunt Ruth taught you some interesting words, Mrs. Delaney observed gently. Maisie nodded, her expression growing thoughtful. Aunt Ruth knows lots of things. She used to be a teacher too, a long time ago. She selected a blue crayon, adding details to her drawing. She taught me how to make toast with cinnamon sugar on top, and how to tie my shoes, and she reads to me when she remembers. This glimpse into the relationship between Maisie and her great-aunt revealed what Mrs. Delaney had suspected. There was genuine love and care there, despite Ruth's declining abilities. You and your Aunt Ruth take care of each other, don't you? Mrs. Delaney said. I help her remember things, Maisie confirmed, and I'm very quiet when her head hurts. She looked up, her blue eyes suddenly vulnerable. Is Aunt Ruth going to get better? Mrs. Delaney chose her words carefully. The doctors are helping her, but the kind of forgetting she has doesn't usually get better. It might get easier for her to manage with the right help, though. Maisie seemed to absorb this, turning it over in her mind. Will we still live in the yellow house? Before Mrs. Delaney could formulate a gentle response to this difficult question, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Time for your medicine, Maisie, she announced cheerfully. And then Dr. Brennan wants to listen to your lungs again. Maisie obediently set down her crayons and followed the nurse, Button tucked securely under her arm. Mrs. Delaney gathered the drawing to save for later, noticing how the colors grew stronger and more confident toward the end, a small sign of Maisie's slowly building security. Later that evening, after returning home for dinner with her husband Robert, Mrs. Delaney received a call from the hospital that sent her heart racing. Mrs. Delaney, this is Nurse Chen from Pediatrics. I'm calling about Maisie Parker. Is something wrong? Mrs. Delaney asked, immediately alert. She's developed a high fever rather suddenly. Dr. Brennan is concerned about pneumonia developing. We're running tests now, but I thought you'd want to know. She's been asking for you. Mrs. Delaney was already reaching for her coat. Tell her I'm on my way. The night drive to the hospital seemed interminable. Robert had insisted on coming with her, and now he drove steadily through the darkness while Mrs. Delaney stared out the window, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She was fine this afternoon, she said, more to herself than to her husband. She was coloring and talking about Button. Robert reached over to squeeze her hand. Kids can get sick quickly, but they also bounce back quickly. Try not to assume the worst. When they arrived at the pediatric floor, they found Maisie curled on her side in the hospital bed, her cheeks flushed with fever, her breathing slightly labored. Dr. Brennan was reviewing test results at the nurse's station. Her immune system is compromised from the prolonged malnutrition, he explained quietly. What would be a simple cold for most children has developed into a more serious respiratory infection. We've started antibiotics, but we need to watch her closely tonight. Mrs. Delaney approached Maisie's bedside. The little girl's eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever but focusing on her teacher's face. You came back, she whispered, her voice raspy. Of course I did, Mrs. Delaney said, taking Maisie's small hand in hers. I heard you weren't feeling well. Maisie nodded weakly. Button doesn't feel good either, she murmured, gesturing to the teddy bear tucked beside her. Mrs. Delaney smiled despite her worry. Then I'll stay and take care of both of you. Throughout the night, Mrs. Delaney remained at Maisie's bedside, cooling her forehead with damp cloths, helping her sip water, and reading softly when the child was awake. Robert brought coffee and stayed until midnight before heading home to rest before his early work shift. As the hours passed and Maisie's fever raged, Mrs. Delaney felt a deepening conviction that this child, this quiet, resilient little girl who asked for so little and endured so much, had somehow become essential to her life. When dawn finally broke, sending pale light through the hospital window, Dr. Brennan returned to check Maisie's vital signs. "The fever's coming down," he announced with cautious optimism. "The antibiotics are starting to work. She's not out of the woods yet, but this is a good sign." Mrs. Delaney nodded, too exhausted for words, still holding Maisie's small hand as the child slept more peacefully than she had all night. In that quiet moment of relief, watching Maisie's chest rise and fall with steadier breaths, Mrs. Delaney made a silent promise to the sleeping child. Whatever obstacles lay ahead in becoming Maisie's foster parent, she would overcome them. This little girl would know security, warmth, and love, not just temporarily, but for as long as she needed it. Golden evening light filtered through the kitchen windows of the Delaney home, casting long shadows across the dining table where Eleanor and Robert sat facing each other. Between them lay a stack of forms, the initial paperwork for becoming foster parents. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Ellie?" Robert asked, his kind face etched with both concern and tenderness. "It's not just taking in a child temporarily. It's midnight fevers, school conferences, emotional challenges we can't even anticipate." Eleanor's fingers traced the edge of the top form, a background check authorization. "I've never been more certain of anything," she said quietly. "When I thought we might lose her to that fever." Her voice faltered. "Robert, I couldn't leave her side. It wasn't just duty or compassion. It was like she was already ours to protect." Robert reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I saw that, and I'm not opposed to this. You know I've always wanted a family with you. I just want to make sure we're going into this with our eyes open." Eleanor nodded, squeezing his hand gratefully. After 22 years of marriage, they still approached major decisions as a team, carefully weighing options together. "The social worker said the process normally takes months," she explained. "Home inspections, training sessions, interviews. By then, Maisie will have been in a group home for weeks, maybe longer. She'll have changed schools, lost the few stable connections she has. And you can't bear that thought," Robert said softly, understanding in his eyes. "No, I can't." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at their modest but well-kept backyard. She's had so much instability already. The thought of her alone in a facility, no one to notice if she's quiet or sad or needs something. She turned back to her husband, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I keep seeing her in that storage closet, Robert, curled up with that old teddy bear, telling me it was warmer there than at home. No child should ever have to say that. No child should ever have to feel that." Robert was silent for a long moment, studying his wife's face. Then he picked up a pen and signed the first form with a decisive stroke. "Then let's make sure Maisie never has to feel that way again." Relief and love washed over Eleanor's face. She crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around her husband's shoulders, pressing her cheek against his. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Robert said with a gentle smile. "I've heard that 6-year-olds have strong opinions about bedtime and vegetables." Eleanor laughed softly, the tension of the moment breaking. "I teach 23 first graders every day. I think we can handle one." Together, they began working through the forms, discussing practical arrangements. The spare bedroom that had been used for storage and exercise equipment would become Maisie's room. They'd need to child-proof certain areas, stock the refrigerator with kid-friendly foods, learn about Maisie's specific needs. "What about Ruth?" Robert asked as they finished the initial paperwork. "Maisie seems very attached to her great-aunt." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Ms. Jackson mentioned that Ruth is being placed in a senior living facility about 15 minutes from here. We could arrange regular visits. I think that would be important for both of them." As they talked, Eleanor found herself imagining scenes from a possible future. Maisie eating breakfast at their kitchen table, planting flowers in the backyard, reading books on the living room couch. Simple, ordinary moments that many took for granted, but that would represent profound security for a child who had known too little of it. The next morning, Eleanor delivered the completed forms to the social services office before heading to the hospital for her daily visit with Maisie. The little girl was recovering well from her fever, sitting up in bed with Button, while a volunteer read her a story. "Mrs. Delaney." Maisie's face brightened when she spotted her teacher in the doorway. "Look what Nurse Chen brought me." She held up a small coloring book of animals. "That's wonderful," Eleanor said, settling into the chair beside Maisie's bed. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Maisie reported. "Dr. Brennan says my lungs sound clearer, and I ate all my breakfast." Eleanor smiled, noticing the healthy pink returning to Maisie's cheeks. "That's excellent progress. You're getting, stronger every day." Maisie nodded, then her expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Jackson came to see me this morning. She said when I leave the hospital I might go to a place with other children for a while." She clutched Button a little tighter. "Will it be like school?" Eleanor's heart ached at the uncertainty in Maisie's voice. She wanted desperately to tell Maisie about the foster parent application, to promise that she would come to live with the Delaneys instead. But until the process was further along, making such promises would be unfair. It would be more like a big home where children stay when they need a safe place, Eleanor explained gently. "But you know what? No matter where you go next, I'll still come to see you. That's a promise." Maisie seemed to consider this carefully, her small face solemn. "And Button too?" "Button too," Eleanor confirmed, reaching out to straighten the teddy bear's worn bow tie. "We're all connected now, the three of us." A small smile touched Maisie's lips. "That's good," she whispered, "because sometimes when I'm scared, Button gets scared too. But he's never scared when you're here." Eleanor swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. Such simple words, yet they confirmed what she already knew in her heart, that this was no ordinary teacher-student relationship. Something deeper had formed between them, a bond of trust and care that felt increasingly like family. As she read Maisie a story and helped her color a page in her new book, Eleanor silently renewed her determination to navigate whatever bureaucratic obstacles might arise. Whatever it took, she would create a home where Maisie and Button would never need to be scared again. The spare room in the Delaney home had accumulated the miscellaneous debris of 22 years of marriage, exercise equipment used sporadically, holiday decorations, boxes of old teaching materials, and the various odds and ends that had no other place to belong. Now, Robert stood in the doorway surveying the chaos with hands on his hips. "It's going to be quite a transformation," he mused as Eleanor joined him. "It's a good thing we have the weekend," she replied, already rolling up her sleeves. The home inspection could happen any time next week. They worked methodically throughout Saturday morning, sorting items into piles: donate, store, discard. Each box, opened, contained its own small journey into their past. Robert's college textbooks, Eleanor's collection of seashells from their honeymoon, photo albums from trips they'd taken together. As Eleanor opened a particular cardboard box tucked far back in the closet, she fell suddenly quiet. Robert glanced over, then came to sit beside her on the floor. Inside lay the items they'd purchased years ago, during the brief, hope-filled months when they'd believed they were finally going to become parents. A small yellow blanket, a stuffed giraffe still with its tags, a row of classic children's books with unmarked spines. "I'd forgotten we still had these," Robert said softly, picking up the giraffe. Eleanor ran her fingers over the blanket's soft edge. "I couldn't bear to give them away even after—" The words hung unspoken between them, even after they'd learned that having biological children wouldn't be possible for them. They had considered adoption back then, but the process had seemed overwhelming amid their grief. Gradually, they had rebuilt their lives around their careers, their home, their life as a couple. Robert placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Maybe these were waiting for the right child all along. Eleanor looked up, tears shimmering in her eyes, but a smile growing on her face. Maybe they were. By Sunday afternoon, the room had been completely transformed. The walls, once a neutral beige, now glowed a soft sky blue. The old exercise equipment had been relocated to the basement, and in its place stood a simple wooden bed with a colorful quilt. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with a first grader's literary treasures, picture books, early readers, and a few chapter books for when Maisie was ready. "What do you think she'll make of this?" Robert asked as they stood admiring their work. Eleanor considered the lovely, welcoming room they'd created. "I think it might overwhelm her at first," she said honestly. "She's used to having so little, but children are adaptable. She'll make it her own in time." On Monday after school, Eleanor drove to the hospital with fresh anticipation buzzing through her. The initial foster care application had been expedited thanks to Principal Garcia's connections at social services, and Ms. Jackson had called that morning to schedule the home inspection for Wednesday. "Things are moving quickly," she'd explained. "Maisie's case has been designated high priority due to her medical situation and the lack of appropriate group home placements." Now, as Eleanor approached Maisie's hospital room, she heard something that made her pause in the doorway. Laughter. Maisie's laugh, light and tentative, as if she were trying it out for the first time. Inside, a hospital volunteer sat beside Maisie's bed, making Button dance along the edge of the blanket while reciting a silly rhyme. Maisie watched with delight, giggling behind her hands when Button took a dramatic tumble. Eleanor stood quietly, not wanting to interrupt this precious moment of childhood joy. Maisie's laughter was like a rare butterfly, beautiful and easily startled into flight. When the volunteer finished her performance and noticed Eleanor, she smiled and took her leave. Maisie's face brightened further when she spotted her. "Teacher, Mrs. Delaney, did you see Button dancing? He was so silly." "I did," Eleanor confirmed, settling into the chair beside the bed. "He's quite the performer." "The lady said I can keep this," Maisie added, holding up a small picture book. "It's about a bear who gets lost and finds a new home." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat at the unintentional parallel to Maisie's situation. "That sounds like a wonderful story." Maisie nodded earnestly. "The bear is scared at first, but then he meets a nice family of rabbits who help him." She looked down at the book cover, tracing the bear illustration with one small finger. "Mrs. Delaney, Ms. Jackson came again this morning. She said I'll leave the hospital soon." "That's good news," Eleanor said carefully. "It means you're getting better. She said I might go to a place called Oakwood until they find a foster family." Maisie's voice dropped to a whisper. "Is Oakwood nice?" Eleanor chose her words thoughtfully, not wanting to frighten Maisie but unwilling to lie. "Oakwood is a place where many children stay when they need somewhere safe. The people there work very hard to take care of everyone." Maisie seemed to hear what wasn't being said. Her small face grew solemn as she hugged Button closer. "Will you still come see me if I go there?" "Absolutely," Eleanor promised, reaching out to smooth a strand of golden hair from Maisie's forehead. "But you know what? There's also a possibility that you might not need to go to Oakwood at all." Maisie's eyes widened slightly. "Where else could I go?" Eleanor took a deep breath. She hadn't planned to mention the foster application until it was further along, but seeing Maisie's anxiety about Oakwood changed her mind. "Well," she said gently, "my husband Robert and I have applied to become foster parents. That means we're asking for permission to have a child live with us for a while, someone who needs a home temporarily." Maisie looked at her teacher with dawning comprehension. "You mean me?" Eleanor nodded, her heart full. "Yes, Maisie. If everything goes well, with our application, we're hoping you might come stay with us instead of going to Oakwood." For a moment, Maisie sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Would Button come too?" Eleanor smiled, blinking back tears. "Button would absolutely come too. We wouldn't dream of separating you." Maisie nodded solemnly, processing this information. She didn't exclaim with excitement or throw her arms around Eleanor as another child might have. Instead, she simply reached out one small hand and placed it trustingly in her teacher's larger one. That quiet gesture of faith, Eleanor thought, was more meaningful than any exuberant display could have been. The Oakwood Children's Center stood 3 stories tall, its brick exterior softened by colorful murals and a playground visible through a chain-link fence. Despite these cheerful touches, there was no disguising its institutional nature as Eleanor and Robert pulled into the visitor parking lot. "Remember, this is temporary," Robert reassured her, squeezing her hand. "Just until our application is processed." Eleanor nodded, trying to quiet the anxiety fluttering in her chest. After 2 weeks in the hospital, Maisie had been discharged yesterday and brought directly to Oakwood. The Delaney's foster application was progressing well, home inspection completed, background checks cleared, but there were still mandatory training sessions to attend and final approvals to secure. The facility's reception area was clean and bright, with children's artwork displayed on the walls. A harried-looking woman greeted them from behind a desk. "We're here to visit Maisie Parker," Eleanor explained. "I'm her teacher, Mrs. Delaney." "Of course," the receptionist nodded, checking a clipboard. "She arrived yesterday. I'll have someone bring her to the visiting room." They were shown to a room furnished with mismatched couches and a small table with chairs. Through the window they could see children of various ages playing in supervised groups on the playground. Everything was orderly, adequate, but it lacked the warmth of a home. The door opened and Maisie appeared, led by a staff member. She wore unfamiliar clothes, clearly from the facility's donation closet, and her golden hair had been pulled back in a practical but uneven ponytail. Her eyes searched the room anxiously, until they landed on the Delaneys. "Mrs. Delaney," she exclaimed, hurrying forward. Then she stopped abruptly, her expression falling. "I forgot Button." "Button isn't with you?" Eleanor asked gently. Maisie shook her head, distress evident in her face. "He was on my bed this morning, but when they called me for breakfast, I left him. When I came back, he was gone." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I looked everywhere." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Robert, whose face reflected her own concern. Button wasn't just a teddy bear. He was Maisie's security, her connection to her parents and the life she'd had before. "I'm sure he'll turn up," the staff member said with well-intentioned cheerfulness. "Things get moved around all the time here. I'll check the laundry." After she left, Maisie climbed onto the couch beside Eleanor, sitting closer than she ever had before. "It's loud here," she confided quietly, "and the other kids ask a lot of questions." "That must be hard," Eleanor sympathized, noting the shadows under Maisie's eyes. "Are you sleeping okay?" Maisie shook her head slightly. "My room has 3 other girls. The little one cries at night and the big one snores." She looked up at Eleanor with solemn eyes. "When can I see Aunt Ruth?" "Very soon," Eleanor promised. "She's settling into her new place, too. Once she's ready for visitors, we'll take you to see her." Robert, who had been quiet, leaned forward with a gentle smile. "Maisie, I've heard so much about you from Eleanor. I'm very glad to finally meet you." Maisie studied him carefully before offering a tiny nod. "You're Mrs. Delaney's husband." "That's right. You can call me Mr. Robert if you like." Their visit continued with Robert showing Maisie a few simple magic tricks he'd learned specially for the occasion. By the end, he'd coaxed a small smile from her, though her eyes still darted occasionally to the door as if hoping Button would magically appear. When it was time to leave, Maisie's face fell. She didn't cry or protest. Eleanor was learning that Maisie rarely expressed her distress openly, but her small shoulders slumped with disappointment. "We'll come back tomorrow," Eleanor promised, kneeling to Maisie's level, "and we'll ask everyone to keep looking for Button." Later that evening, Eleanor received a call from Oakwood. Button was still missing, and Maisie had refused. Dinner, sitting silently in a corner of the common room, watching the door as if waiting for someone to arrive. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She kept thinking of Maisie alone in a strange bed, surrounded by strangers, without even Button for comfort. At dawn, she made a decision. "I'm going. Back today," she told Robert over early morning coffee. "I'll bring her the yellow blanket and stuffed giraffe from the spare room. It's not button, but it's something. Robert nodded in understanding. I think that's exactly what she needs right now, to know someone is thinking specifically of her. Time at Oakwood seemed to move both too quickly and too slowly. For Maisie, each day stretched endlessly as she navigated the unfamiliar routines and personalities of the Children's Center. For the Delaney's, the days flew by in a flurry of foster parent training sessions, paperwork submissions, and daily visits to Maisie. The yellow blanket and stuffed giraffe had helped. Maisie kept them neatly arranged on her assigned bed, and the other girls in her room had eventually stopped teasing her about them. But they weren't button, and everyone knew it. On their fourth visit, Eleanor and Robert arrived to find Maisie sitting alone at a small table in the corner of the visiting room, coloring with intense concentration. She looked up when they entered, her solemn face brightening slightly. "I made this for you," she said, pushing the drawing toward them as they sat down. It was a picture of a house, not the small yellow house she used to draw, but a new creation with a blue door and flowers in the yard. 3 figures stood in front: a tall man, a woman with curly hair like Eleanor's, and a small girl holding what appeared to be a teddy bear. "This is beautiful, Maisie," Eleanor said, softly recognizing the hopeful vision for what it was. "Is that Button with you in the picture?" Maisie nodded. "I pretend he's still with me," she admitted in a whisper. "Sometimes I talk to him in my head." Robert studied the drawing with genuine appreciation. "You're quite the artist. I especially like the flowers. What kind are they?" "Daisies," Maisie replied. "Aunt Ruth had some in her garden a long time ago." The mention of Ruth created an opening for Eleanor to share some good news. "We visited your aunt yesterday," she told Maisie. "Her new place is very nice, with a garden and a sunroom where residents can read. She's looking forward to seeing you this weekend." Maisie's eyes widened. "Really? I can go see her?" "Really," Eleanor confirmed. "We've arranged it with Ms. Jackson. We'll pick you up Saturday morning." For the first time since coming to Oakwood, Maisie showed genuine excitement, asking questions about Ruth's new home and what they would do during the visit. The spark of animation in her face reminded Eleanor of the brief moment in the hospital when she'd laughed at Button's dance, glimpses of the child Maisie might be when not weighed down by worry. As their visit continued, Eleanor noticed Maisie frequently glancing toward the supply closet at the far end of the visiting room. Following her gaze, Eleanor saw nothing unusual about the closed door. "Maisie," she asked gently, "is there something interesting about that closet?" The little girl looked down quickly, a flush spreading across her cheeks. "No," she mumbled, then after a pause added, "It's just, sometimes I like small spaces. They feel safer." Eleanor felt her heart contract with understanding. The storage closet at school where she'd found Maisie that night, it had been a refuge of sorts, a small enclosed space where the child had sought comfort and warmth. Later, as they prepared to leave, Mrs. Chen, one of the kinder staff members, approached with news. "We're still looking for Button," she assured them. "But I wanted you to know that Maisie's been helping some of the younger children with their reading. She's very patient with them." Eleanor wasn't surprised. Even in her own difficult circumstances, Maisie had a natural inclination to care for others. It was part of what made her special, and what made the wait to bring her home all the more difficult. That evening, Eleanor and Robert sat at their kitchen table with Ms. Jackson, reviewing the final steps of their application. "You've completed all the required training in record time," the social worker noted with approval. "The home inspection report is excellent. We're just waiting on the final committee review, which is scheduled for next Tuesday." "And if they approve?" Robert asked, trying not to sound too eager. Ms. Jackson smiled. "Then Maisie could be placed with you as early as next Wednesday." Hope bubbled up in Eleanor's chest, but she tempered it with caution. "What if they find some reason to deny the application?" "I don't anticipate that happening," Ms. Jackson assured her. "You've met all the criteria, and Maisie's caseworker is strongly in favor of this placement. It's just a matter of following proper procedure." As Ms. Jackson gathered her papers to leave, she paused, I should mention, we've had a development regarding Button. Eleanor and Robert both looked up sharply. One of the older girls admitted to taking him, Ms. Jackson explained. She claimed she was just borrowing him, but unfortunately the bear was damaged when she tried to wash him. The staff is attempting to repair him, but the thought of Button, Maisie's most treasured connection to her parents, being damaged was almost too much to bear. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, gathering her composure. "Please let us know when he's ready," she said finally. "Whether repaired or not. Maisie needs him back." After Ms. Jackson left, Eleanor and Robert sat in silence for a moment, processing how close they were to bringing Maisie home, and yet how many things could still go wrong. "One more week," Robert said at last, reaching for Eleanor's hand. "Just one more week of waiting." Eleanor nodded, squeezing his fingers. "For all of us." Saturday morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect for Maisie's long-awaited visit with Ruth. Eleanor and Robert arrived at Oakwood early, both excited to give Maisie this important connection to her past, even as they hoped to become part of her future. Mrs. Chen met them in the reception area, her usually cheerful face marked with concern. "I'm glad you're here," she said quietly. "We've had a difficult morning with Maisie." Eleanor's heart sank. "What happened?" "It started at breakfast," Mrs. Chen explained, leading them toward the residential wing. "One of the older children accidentally spilled juice on Maisie's drawing, the one she was saving to show her great aunt. She became very quiet, which isn't unusual for her, but then during morning activities she disappeared." "Disappeared?" Robert echoed, alarmed. "We found her." "Quickly," Mrs. Chen assured them. "She was in the supply closet in the craft room, huddled behind some boxes. When Ms. Patel tried to coax her out, Maisie became unusually distressed. They rounded a corner and Eleanor immediately spotted Maisie sitting alone on a bench in the hallway, her small shoulders hunched, staring fixedly at the floor. The yellow blanket Eleanor had brought was clutched tightly in her hands, its edge twisted anxiously between her fingers. "Maisie?" Eleanor called softly, approaching slowly. The little girl looked up, her face tear-streaked but composed in a way that seemed unnatural for a 6-year-old. When she recognized the Delaney's, something in her expression shifted, a barely perceptible relaxation, like a wild animal recognizing someone who had been kind to it before. "We still going to see Aunt Ruth?" she asked in a small voice. "Absolutely," Eleanor confirmed, kneeling to Maisie's level. "She's expecting us, but Mrs. Chen tells me you've had a rough morning. Do you want to talk about it?" Maisie shook her head, eyes downcast again. "I didn't mean to make Ms. Patel mad." "She's not mad," Mrs. Chen interjected gently. "She was just worried when you wouldn't come out of the closet." Robert knelt down beside Eleanor, his kind face level with Maisie's. "Sometimes when people feel overwhelmed, they look for a quiet place to feel safe. There's nothing wrong with that." Maisie glanced up at him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face at being understood rather than scolded. "The closet was small and dark," she whispered, "like the one at school. But they wouldn't let me stay." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Robert, both recognizing the significance of this. The storage closet at school had been Maisie's refuge, a place where, despite the cold and discomfort, she had felt secure enough to sleep. Being forcibly removed from a similar safe space at Oakwood had triggered something deep and raw. "Maisie," Eleanor said carefully, "can you tell us why you needed the closet this morning?" The little girl's fingers worked the edge of the yellow blanket more frantically. "Too many people," she managed finally. "Too loud. And my picture for Aunt Ruth got ruined and—" her voice cracked. "And Button isn't here and I don't know when I can go home. Any home." The last words emerged as a sob that seemed to surprise even Maisie herself. She quickly pressed her hands to her mouth, as if trying to push the sound back in, her eyes wide with alarm at her own outburst. Eleanor moved instinctively, gathering Maisie gently into her arms. For a moment, the child's body remained rigid with tension. Then, gradually, she melted against Eleanor's shoulder, her small frame shaking with silent tears. "I just want somewhere safe," she whispered against Eleanor's neck, the words so quiet they might have been missed if not for their devastating simplicity. Robert placed his hand gently on Maisie's back, his eyes meeting Eleanor's over the child's head. The same fierce protectiveness shone in both their gazes, a silent vow that this little girl would never again have to hide in closets seeking safety she couldn't find elsewhere. "Maisie," Eleanor said softly, still holding her close, "Mr. Robert and I are doing everything we can to make our home a place where you can stay. The people who make these decisions are meeting on Tuesday, and if they say yes, you could come live with us very soon." "With Button too?" Maisie asked, her voice muffled against Eleanor's shoulder. "With Button too," Robert confirmed. "Mrs. Chen says they're fixing him up right now." Slowly, Maisie's tears subsided. She straightened, wiping her eyes with the edge of the yellow blanket. With characteristic resilience, she seemed to gather herself, piece by fragile piece. "I still want to see Aunt Ruth," she stated firmly. Eleanor smiled, brushing a strand of golden hair from Maisie's damp cheek. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." As they walked toward the exit, Maisie slipped one small hand into Eleanor's, and after a moment's hesitation, the other into Robert's. This simple gesture of trust, of connection, spoke volumes about how far they had come and how far they still hoped to go together. The blue room waited, bathed in morning sunlight. Eleanor stood in the doorway, making one final inspection. Fresh sheets on the bed, colorful books arranged on shelves, a small nightlight plugged in beside the dresser. Everything was ready. "They're here," Robert called from downstairs. Eleanor took a deep breath and headed down to join him. After weeks of paperwork, inspections, and anxious waiting, the moment had finally arrived. The foster care committee had approved their application, and today, Maisie would come home with them. The doorbell rang, and Robert opened it to reveal Ms. Jackson standing on the porch with Maisie beside her. The little girl wore the same donated clothes from Oakwood, her small backpack clutched in front of her. Her eyes were wide as she took in the Delaney home. "Welcome, Maisie," Robert said, warmly. She stepped inside cautiously, looking around with the careful assessment of a child who had learned to quickly evaluate new environments. "Would you like to see your room?" Eleanor asked gently. Maisie nodded, following Eleanor up the stairs while Ms. Jackson and Robert discussed final paperwork below. At the door to the blue room, Maisie stopped, her breath catching audibly. "This is for me?" she whispered. "All for you," Eleanor confirmed. Maisie took a tentative step inside, then another. She touched the colorful quilt with wondering fingers, ran her hand along the bookshelf, and peered out the window at the backyard below. "It's the house from my drawing," she said softly. "But real." Eleanor smiled. "It is now." Maisie turned, her solemn face reflecting a complex mix of hope and hesitancy. "Can I keep the door open just a little?" "Of course," Eleanor said, understanding immediately. No more closets, no more hiding places, but still the need for a clear escape route, an open path to safety. Later, after Ms. Jackson had left, they showed Maisie around the house, explaining the simple routine they'd follow. When they reached the kitchen, Robert opened the refrigerator. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "We thought we'd make pancakes to celebrate your first day here." Maisie nodded, then paused as if remembering something important. "Can we save some for Button when he comes back?" Eleanor and Robert exchanged glances. The staff at Oakwood had been unable to fully repair the beloved teddy bear, and he remained there awaiting collection. "Actually," Robert said, reaching into a cabinet, "we have something for you." He handed Maisie a small gift bag. She opened it carefully to find Button inside, still worn and threadbare, one ear partially detached. His bow tie missing, but unmistakably Button. "We picked him up yesterday," Eleanor explained. "They tried to fix him, but some of his seams were too worn." Maisie clutched the teddy bear to her chest, her eyes shining with tears of relief. "He's still perfect," she whispered. "He's still mine." In that moment, watching Maisie reunite with her most treasured possession, Eleanor and Robert glimpsed the road ahead, a path of small triumphs and inevitable challenges as they helped this resilient child learn to trust in permanence again. It wouldn't be easy, but as Maisie stood in their kitchen, Button secure in her arms and the faintest smile touching her lips, they knew with absolute certainty that it would be worth it. 6 months had transformed Maisie Parker in ways both visible and invisible. Her golden hair, now neatly trimmed, shone in the spring sunlight as she worked intently at her desk in Mrs. Patel's art class. Around her, other first graders chattered and compared their drawings, but Maisie focused with characteristic concentration on her work. 5 more minutes, Mrs. Patel announced to the class. Then we'll share our "What Makes Me Happy" pictures. Maisie added a final careful detail to her drawing and sat back with quiet satisfaction. When her turn came to share, she walked to the front of the classroom with Button tucked securely under her arm, a companion she still carried, though less frequently than before. "This is my picture," she explained, her voice soft but steady. "It shows me and Button and Mr. Robert and Mrs. Eleanor. We're at the park with Aunt Ruth. And this," she pointed to a word carefully printed at the bottom of the page, "is what makes me happy." The word, written in a child's careful hand, was simple but profound. Safe. That evening, Eleanor placed the drawing on the refrigerator while Robert helped Maisie with her reading. The little girl who had once sought warmth in a school storage closet now had a home, a family, and a future bright with possibility. The journey wasn't over. Healing rarely follows a straight path. But with each passing day, Maisie's quiet smile reached her eyes more often, illuminating the truth in that single, powerful word she had chosen to share with her class. Safe. At last.